How, precisely, does everything come from the One? For Plotinus, there is an essential double movement in all being. That is a movement or activity of procession outward or descent, and a movement of return or conversion to the higher generative principle. This activity can be likened to a circle unfolding itself into radii and circumference, but still rooted in its center, which is itself rooted in the center of all centers beyond it. Or it can be likened to a physical light that shines outward. However, that which stems from the One is not spatial, as in something that is confined to the limitations of space and time. But rather this movement denotes the source and the goal of all real beings, that is, where they have come from and where they are going to. Since all being is timelessly dependent and derivative, that derivation has to be expressed in the time-bound language of movement out of and movement back to a principle. Since for Plotinus, intellect is not just rest, but also involves intellectual movement. In an important passage on the generation and order of those things after the first, Plotinus first expresses this relation paradoxically, following Plato's Parmenides. The One is all things, and no one of them. He then goes on to describe the derivation, or emanation, as it is often called, but perhaps misleadingly, since it is non-spatial.
This is the first act of generation, as it were, being perfect because it seeks nothing, has nothing, needs nothing. The One, so to speak, overflows, and its overfullness has made another. And what has come to be turned back to it and was filled, and in looking to it, this came to be intellect. Its rest in relation to the One made being, but its vision in relation to it made intellect. Since it stopped in relation to the One so that it might see, it becomes at once intellect and being. This, then, being like that One, makes similar things, pouring forth a multiple power. This activity springing from the substance of intellect is soul, which comes to be this while intellect remains in itself.
We should note here, first, a principle that Plotinus emphasizes in many other places. All real beings are productive and give of themselves without being diminished. Physical things are not self-sustaining, but they act in a similar way.
And all things, as long as they remain in themselves, necessarily produce from their own substance, out of the power which is present, a surrounding reality directed to what is outside of them, a kind of image of the archetypes out of which they have grown. Fire generates heat from it, and snow does not keep its cold only inside itself. As long as they exist, something goes forth from them around them, and what is near profits from their existence. And all things that are already complete generate. The One is always perfect, and so complete eternally.
This production, then, is a sort of double activity, an act of the substance that produces an act from or out of the substance of the thing. What is produced is an image of the generator, and it acts by virtue of the power given to it. The power of the generator is nonetheless intimately present to it, since it exists by virtue of its immediate intimacy with the generator.
Intellect sees the One not as separated from him, but because it is after him and there is nothing in between, as there is nothing between soul and intellect. Everything longs for its parent and loves this, and most of all when they are alone, parent and offspring. But when the parent is the best, the offspring is necessarily with him, so as to be separated only by otherness.
There is also a moment of indeterminacy, or hyperdeterminacy, in the generation of intellect, the overfullness or overflow of the One. Plotinus represents this as the procession of a sort of unformed potentiality that must turn back to the One to be actualized as a distinct entity. We might well suppose that since everything must be included in this procession, then all desires that in some way are based upon the good must also in some sense be included. If so, then form and intellectual determination are not necessarily the most valuable signs of all manifestations of existence. A certain kind of unformedness, like the one in us, in our desires, hopes, hunches, might be even more important in the meaning of human lives, yet obviously will be easy to overlook since it is not a definite this or that. Developing a thought from Plato's Republic, every soul pursues the real good, and divines that it is something. Therefore, Plotinus says we must consider
that people have forgotten that which from the beginning till now they long for and desire. For all things reach out to that and desire it by necessity of nature, as if divining that they cannot exist without it. And the apprehension of the beautiful and the astonishment and the waking up of love are for those who are already, as it were, knowing it and awake to it. But the good, since it is long present to awake a desire natural to it, is present even to those asleep, and does not astonish those who at any time see it, because it is always there.
For Plotinus, the quiet presence of the good is at the root of all giving and receiving, as well as at the root of the return of real beings to self-knowing in the vision of the principles before them. This quiet presence is so familiar that we do not even notice it. Beauty, he says, astonishes and can be painful because one must have seen it to know passionate desire for it, whereas the desire for the good is more ancient and unperceived. A third important consequence of Plotinus's derivation theory is that reality is neither simply objective nor simply subjective, but it has to bend back or return through itself to its source. All being is, therefore, essentially self-reflexive. Following Plato's likening of the good to the light of the sun in the Republic, Plotinus emphasizes that the intelligibility of being depends not only upon the receptivity of being itself, but, above all, upon the self-disclosing gift of the good, which, like the light of the sun, is the medium in which anything becomes visible. Consequently, in descriptive arguments about the derivation of intellect from the one and of soul from intellect, intellect is active and in itself, but passive to the productive power of the one.
So then intellect came to be in being filled, and having been filled it was, and simultaneously it was perfected and saw.
In other words, none of the creative activities of life depend entirely on ourselves. Rather, they require the awakening of a higher form of seeing, and even the appropriate forms of invocation. In the approach to intelligible reality, for instance, Plotinus tells us to make a faithful picture of this world in our thought, and
calling upon the God who made that of which you have the mental picture, pray him to come. And may he come, bringing his own universe with him.
We can prepare for the vision, but we cannot compel it. In this way, philosophy and religion are not divorced from each other, but are by necessity philosophically integrated with one another.